Dr. Dark 1 Scary Stories. Story 1. It was one of those nights where you question every decision you've ever made. I should have stayed at the office a bit longer or maybe even crashed at a friend's place, but no. I wanted my own bed. The snowstorm hit hard and the visibility was terrible. My wipers could barely keep up, and my GPS had already failed me twice. That's how I ended up on this shortcut. A narrow, icy road surrounded by endless trees. The kind of place where if your car broke down, no one would find you until spring. The wind howled, making the car rattle. I clenched the wheel tighter, trying to stay focused. But then it happened. The tires skidded, and before I knew it, I was sliding sideways. The car finally came to a stop, stalled right near an old, rusted train crossing. I swore under my breath and grabbed my phone, but of course, no signal. I stepped out to check the damage, instantly regretting it as the cold pierced through my jacket. The snow crunched beneath my boots, and the only light came from my headlights reflecting off the falling flakes. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were small, like a child's, and they led from the side of the road to the tracks. Something about them wasn't right. They weren't fresh. They seemed almost etched into the ice beneath the snow. I followed them, my breath fogging up in front of me. The tracks were covered in ice, but the prints continued, perfectly visible. They led straight to the middle of the crossing, and then they just stopped. No scuffle, no drag marks, no sign of anyone turning back. Just an eerie, abrupt end. I stood there, staring, my heart pounding. A low, distant whistle cut through the silence. It couldn't be. This track looked abandoned. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint rumble of an approaching train. But when I turned, the tracks were empty. No lights, no engine. Yet, the sound of metal on metal was unmistakable, and the ground began to shake. I froze, unsure of what to do, when suddenly the crossing lights flickered on, their red glow bouncing off the snow. The gates creaked as they lowered. Panic set in. I sprinted back toward my car, slipping and sliding on the ice. But when I got there, the doors were locked. I hadn't locked them. My keys were in my pocket. I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then I saw it. In the reflection of the driver's side window, there was a figure standing on the tracks where the footprints had stopped. A child, maybe 10 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His face was pale, almost glowing, and his eyes, they were completely black. He raised a hand and pointed directly at me. I felt the temperature drop even more, like the cold was seeping into my bones. The whistle blared again, deafening this time. I turned back toward the tracks, but the figure was gone. The train was almost on top of me now, its headlights finally appearing. Except it wasn't a train. There was no engine, no cars, just a blinding light and the sound of screams, like 100 voices crying out in terror. The next thing I knew, I was lying in the snow, gasping for air. The tracks were silent again, and my car was running, the driver's door wide open. I scrambled inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the wheel. I floored it, not caring about the ice, not looking back. When I finally made it home, I sat in my driveway for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just happened. But the thing that haunts me the most? When I went to grab my phone, there was a single notification on the screen. A missed call from an unknown number, time-stamped 2:13 a.m., the exact moment I saw that figure. The message under it was just 2 words: stay away. Story 2. We were supposed to have a peaceful holiday, just me, my parents, and my younger brother. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods and blanketed in snow. Honestly, it seemed perfect. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, just quiet. We spent the first day settling in, playing board games by the fireplace and watching the snow fall outside the big living room window. That night, after we'd all gone to bed, I woke up for some reason. It was pitch black except for the moonlight reflecting off the snow. I sat up and glanced out the window. That's when I saw them. Faint, flickering lights in the distance. They weren't steady like flashlights or lanterns. They almost looked like candles being carried through the trees. I rubbed my eyes thinking I was imagining it, but the lights were still there. They didn't move much, just swayed back and forth. I debated waking my parents, but eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, probably just another cabin out there we didn't know about. I fell back asleep, hoping it wouldn't bother me anymore. The next morning, I mentioned the lights to my dad. He looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no other cabin around here," he said. "It's just us for miles." That only made me more curious. After breakfast, I convinced my brother to hike out with me toward the spot where I'd seen the lights. We walked for what felt like forever, crunching through the snow, our breath freezing in front of us. But all we found were trees, no paths, no signs of life, nothing. I even checked the ground for footprints, but the snow was untouched. We eventually gave up and headed back, both feeling a little uneasy. That night, the lights returned. This time, they were closer, almost at the edge of the trees. I felt my stomach drop. I called my brother over and we both stared out the window. "Do you see that?" I whispered. He nodded, his face pale. We told our parents, who tried to brush it off, but when my dad looked out and saw the lights, his expression changed. "Probably hunters," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. We locked all the doors and tried to ignore it, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Around midnight, I was still awake, heart racing. The lights hadn't moved, but something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. A soft tapping on the window. I froze. The tapping came again, more insistent. Slowly, I turned my head, and for a second, I thought I saw a shadow pass by. I bolted out of bed and ran to wake my parents. My dad grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the front door, shining the light into the woods. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But the lights had vanished. We didn't sleep that night. By morning, we were ready to pack up and leave, but when we stepped outside, we found something chilling. In the fresh snow around the cabin were dozens of footprints. They circled the house, leading back toward the woods. The weirdest part? The prints were barefoot. As we piled into the car, I glanced back one last time. Just beyond the tree line, I saw them again, those flickering lights. But this time, they weren't swaying. They were perfectly still, almost like they were watching us leave. And then, just before we pulled away, they blinked out all at once. Story 3. When my grandfather passed, I didn't expect to inherit anything, let alone his old lodge up in the mountains. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but I remembered it well. Big wooden beams, a fireplace that always seemed too big for the room, and that frozen lake out back. It felt strange driving up the winding road to claim something that felt so far removed from my life. But when I finally saw the lodge again, half buried in snow, I felt a weird mix of nostalgia and unease. The place was exactly how I remembered it, only dustier, quieter. The air inside was heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. My dog, Max, seemed on edge from the moment we arrived. He stayed close to me, ears perked, eyes darting around like he was waiting for something to jump out at him. It wasn't until the second day that I noticed the whispers. I was clearing out the attic, sifting through old photo albums and boxes of junk, when I decided to take a break. I stepped out back for some fresh air, and that's when I heard it. Faint, almost like wind, but too rhythmic. It sounded like a voice just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out any words, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. Max was growling softly, his eyes locked on the frozen lake. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind moving through the trees. But the whispers didn't stop. Every time I got near the lake, they'd start again. Always faint, always just out of reach. Max refused to go near the lake, no matter how much I coaxed him. He'd bark and pull back, his fur standing on end. It was unsettling, to say the least. One night I couldn't sleep. The whispers had been getting louder, more insistent. I kept hearing them in my dreams, and every time I woke up, Max would be sitting by the door, growling low in his throat. I finally gave up on sleep around midnight and decided to step outside. The cold air hit me like a wall, but it felt good to clear my head. The lake was glowing under the moonlight, a smooth, unbroken sheet of ice. I stared at it for a long time, half expecting something to happen. And then, it did. At first I thought it was a shadow, but as I moved closer I realized there was a figure beneath the ice, a face, pale and distorted, staring up at me with hollow eyes. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, it just watched. Max was barking like crazy now, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The whispers were louder than ever, almost deafening, and I swear I could hear my name. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and that's when I noticed the cracks forming in the ice. The figure's mouth opened, and I swear I saw it smile. I bolted back to the lodge, slamming the door behind me. Max wouldn't stop barking, pacing in circles as if trying to warn me. I locked every door, every window, and sat by the fire, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But when I glanced out the window, I saw them. Wet footprints leading from the lake to the lodge, stopping just outside the door. The whispers didn't stop after that. If anything, they grew louder. And now, every night, I hear knocking on the back door, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the porch. Max refuses to leave my side, and honestly, I'm too afraid to even look outside. But the worst part? This morning, I found a new set of footprints, this time leading from the lodge back to the lake. And they were mine.